Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Red Bull are carrying a 10% reduction to their wind tunnel and CFD testing time this season as a penalty for breaching the cost cap back in 2021, but you wouldn't know it looking at their performances on track so far this season, and Fred Vasseur from Ferrari made the point that their penalty was very minor indeed, to the point of being negligible given the situation so far. Christian Horner gives his thoughts on the matter though and says down the line this season we might see that penalty start to take effect. Very much intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. First of all, an update on where the Grand Prix might be for next season 2024. Further rumours emerging that Kyalami in South Africa is very likely indeed, but sources are saying that Spa might be out. The season is probably going to start in Saudi Arabia. I think testing is going to be in Bahrain. The Saudi Arabian guys want the season to start there. Japan might be in March, slightly earlier in the year, so they're going to change some things around. Spa does not have a contract for next year, and therefore if Kyalami comes in, it's unclear exactly what might be on its way out, especially when you hear words like this from Stefano Domenicali, who says for the historic venues to be arrogant and to believe you have a guaranteed future because you've had a race since 100 years ago is not enough. When historic circuits only look behind, it's no good. They have a good foundation to look ahead with a different, beautiful future. With the so-called historic GPs, we are focused on understanding their view of the future. We are not playing any games. We are very transparent with them. We are saying that if they want to be in the calendar, they need to be doing the things we believe is right for them and also for us as F1. So I don't necessarily disagree with part of what he's saying here, but just interesting timing that there's been some concerns about whether Spa even last year was going to continue on the track into this year. It is, but still from now, Domenicali's like, look, guys, don't look at the past, look at the future, and, you know, does raise into question circuits like Monaco and Spa and other historic tracks that have been around for a long time. Spa, for example, has issues with accessibility and other problems like this, despite being arguably the best circuit on the calendar. Big news on the AlphaTauri side as well, with rumours emerging they're going to take more of a Ferrari-Haas relationship with Red Bull going forwards. Makes sense really, because AlphaTauri should be far better than they are over the last couple of seasons. Given how good the Red Bull is, you'd think AlphaTauri could at least be competitive. Given the fact that Aston Martin, they buy a lot from Mercedes, they've obviously done very well with that. AlphaTauri have been surprisingly independent from the Red Bull in terms of their technical team and exactly what they bring over from the Red Bull camp. That is going to change. They're now going to bring further things over from Red Bull. Discussions around getting the front wheel suspension and possibly everything they can from Red Bull they'll bring onto the AlphaTauri, which is basically what Haas do with the Ferrari. They buy all that they're allowed to buy within the regulations and build everything else around that. AlphaTauri for some reason haven't really been doing that in the last few years. Their car was pretty good a couple of years ago, 2021. Even last year they got P5 in Baku, but this year their car's actually quite slow in a straight line compared to last year's car, and with Red Bull being super good, Helmut Marko has said, look, they're not delivering up to expectations and they're going to try and change that going forward. So they're going to relocate them probably to the UK near enough, especially when the Red Bull new wind tunnel comes online. Share that with AlphaTauri and that's probably going to be beneficial for this team moving up the order yet again. Speaking of Alpine as well, they are bringing some big upgrades to Baku. Many teams are going to wait until Imola to bring their big upgrade packages, but Alpine are going quickly, and even Otmar reckons that if the progress is as good as we think, we can compete with Mercedes. Mercedes probably not expected to be quite so good in Baku compared to as they were in Australia, given the limitations of their cars. So Alpine reckon they could compete there. It'll be interesting to see if that's the case in a couple of weekends' time. Big update on Ferrari as well. They have had an update on Sainz's penalty review. I still don't expect this to get overturned, but it's going to be heard by the stewards on the 18th of April, so next Tuesday. And as we can see here, it's like going to be an online meeting through Zoom or something where they're going to discuss whether they want to overturn Sainz's penalty. Now, Ferrari have some interesting points. They say, look, the Gasly Ocon incident went unpunished. The Sargent versus Nick de Vries incident went completely unnoticed, it seems. So, you know, why should Sainz get a penalty here and try and get it reversed? So, yeah, they'll give it a go. 18th is when we're going to have some further updates on whether this has actually gone through or not. But speaking of Ferrari, we know that Fred Vasseur's made a point that they can't just restart their car from scratch. The cost gap is a thing that they have to deal with, and Ferrari committed really their resources going into the season to a development plan for the SF23, and they're going to have to follow through with that. Whether that concept is actually viable compared to the Red Bull in the longer term seems questionable. Sainz doesn't seem to think so, whereas Mercedes are going to bring what is effectively a W14B spec type car to Imola in a couple of races time and consolidate the upgrades in Spain, and we'll see how competitive they can be then compared to the Red Bull. But the teams can't just spend $400-500 million in the season to build an entirely new car. They simply don't have the money under the $140 $48 million, whatever it is this year, cost cap they are now under. Now, Fred Vasseur made the point on Red Bull, right? Because Red Bull, I think to many, got off quite lightly with their budget gap breach in 2021. Many teams said, look, they broke the budget gap in 21 by, okay, a couple of $1 million, but even Hamilton said, look, a new front wing design is $250K, and that could be the difference between winning or losing the championship that year. They ended up getting a penalty towards the end of last year in 2021, but by which point the extra money they'd spent could have theoretically gone towards next year's development in 2022 from the 21 season, and therefore, because they weren't punished last year, that additional development budget then gets carried over again to the development of this year's car for 2023. So the argument for the teams was, look, they've benefited for 2 to 3 years off that breach before it's been penalised, and now the penalty comes in, but even people said at the time, is the penalty really that severe? Because Aston Martin, being I think the 7th place constructors team last year, they get 100% of the allowance for wind tunnel and CFD testing. The teams further down get marginally more, the teams further up get marginally less, to the point where Red Bull would have 70% of the allocation, Mercedes will have 80%, with Ferrari at 75% of the total numbers, and that's translated into hours per month effectively. Now, Red Bull got a 10% penalty, which brought that 70% down to 63%. So, percentage point wise, only a 7 percentage point reduction, not exactly mega. And despite Christian Horner at the time saying, oh, this is draconian, like, I can't believe they would do such a thing, they also fined them $7 million, and he said, wow, this is so much money and all this type of stuff. So, obviously it's Horner playing up for the cameras a little bit, but Fred Vasseur has now said, look, Red Bull are dominating this season, and they're probably going to win both championships again. It was not a penalty, Vasseur says, it was very low indeed, and he went on to say the following, that 10% is worth 1/10 of a second over the course of a season, when you extrapolate the factors, in his opinion at least, which is, in his opinion, pretty much negligible. Now, I think it was always inevitable in a way, and even he makes an interesting point on the marginal returns, as in the first 63% of their testing time will deliver 99% of the results probably for what they're going to get, and then the additional 7% is, that they lose isn't really going to do that much in terms of marginal gains on their return. But I think it was also inevitable that the cost cap penalty was not going to affect them much at the start of the season. They had already done the large part of their development for this year before the penalty was even applied, and now it's come into place. They can feel free to still use all of their 90% allocation of that 70% that they have up until when they want to stop using it, and by the time that penalty really hits them, it's going to be way down the line towards the end of this season. So some expected, they're like, look, Red Bull are still going to be unbelievable at the start of the season, as it's turned out they are, but give it a few months, slightly further down the line, that's when we might see it start to bite them. But the thing is, for Red Bull, they might be able to just abandon the RB19 and start focus on next year's car and really alleviate the penalty, because they're just going to be that far ahead. Now, Christian Horner comments on this and says, look, everyone's got an opinion, everyone is free to have an opinion. The team have done a great job over the winter on limited wind tunnel time that we have had to develop this car, which is technically true, but the reality is they can use all the time they want in the winter because it's spread over the season, and then, if they're going to lose some time down the line, they can just allocate that to the summer where things are pretty much already set in stone. It will have an impact though later into the year and on to next year, because it's a 12-month thing starting from, I think, November last year or something. So it's expected that down the line, and as he says, it's a snapshot of 3 races. It's hugely premature in terms of the season. There's an awful lot of racing still to go. Now, I know Horner's very quietly confident that they're going to win a lot of races this year, which they most certainly are. But I do think that he has a point on it being slightly premature to say that this cost cap penalty was irrelevant. At the end of the season, we might see some impact of that when it comes to later season development, especially with Ferrari and Mercedes continuing to push. So, he still describes it as a tough penalty. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that, but I do think that it should have some impact down the line, whether that's just that they abandon this car early and go to next year's car earlier than they would otherwise, which means that at the end of this season, there's going to be more chances for Mercedes or Aston or Ferrari to pick up a win now and again, but it might not make too much difference in the grand scheme of things, or the other teams get closer quicker than they expected. Red Bull have to commit more to development in the latter half of the season, which means they have to sacrifice more on next year's car, which is also a possibility as well. So I think that Horner probably has a point that it's slightly premature to say whether the cost cap penalty was irrelevant, but nonetheless, you look at the results on track so far, and you've got to say that it didn't didn't really have any particular impact. And it does make you wonder whether other teams could strategically get away with it, right? Because like if you were going to breach the cost cap and get a penalty like Red Bull have, but gain significant advantage from doing it in that particular season, and the penalty is only really affecting you in about 2 years' time, then is it actually worth it? The thing that Red Bull have is that their brand is, they're an energy drinks company. They don't have to worry so much about reputational impact as a Ferrari or Mercedes. If they were seen to be cheating, like that is a death sentence in part to their brand. Red Bull, it doesn't really matter so much. That's just the way their brand identity is set up. So they can kind of get away with it a bit more. And even if the penalty, if Mercedes or Ferrari were to go over the cap and try and deliberately take a strategic penalty that they feel they would get more advantage of in the short term than what the penalty would cost, I don't really think they could get away with it for other factors. So intrigued to hear your thoughts on that in the comment section below. Just one final thing to mention for you guys before we close out the video. Stefano Domenicali's at it again, talking about the fact that the dominance of Red Bull is going to be a turn-off for the sports avid fans and not for the newer fans, which is an interesting statement because from my perspective, it should be the entirely opposite way around. No, the avid fans that have been around for, let's just say you've followed Formula 1 for 15, 20 years. I think I've followed Formula 1 for about 15 years at this point since I was a kid. We've seen the booms and the busts of the Red Bull Vettel period, the Hamilton Mercedes period, and now into the Red Bull Verstappen period, it seems. If I'd have been around even longer into the Ferrari Schumacher days, it's a cycle that happens in Formula 1. There's dominance, they build icons as a result, and then the dominance ends, a new team comes along. That's just how the cycle goes. And while they might not like it, can appreciate it as part of the sport to a certain extent. The newer fans, though, that came in with all the drama of Drive to Survive and saw great seasons like even, some of the Ferrari versus Mercedes years were, and certainly 2021, the idea that there's only 2 drivers that can realistically win on any individual weekends is surely going to be more of a turn-off to newer audiences than it is to audiences that have been around a while. But yeah, not exactly sure where he's coming from there, but just another strange statement from the F1 CEO. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.